purpose of this video is to provide an overview for the material that we will be discussing for chapters 16 and 17, which will be covering acid-base chemistry. This video will serve as an overview of what we will be discussing related to those two chapters. The overall goal of the series of videos related to acid-base chemistry is that by the end of the series of videos, you should be able to determine the pH given the pOH, or vice versa, determine the pH and pOH of a solution given the Ka or Kb of an acid or base and its initial concentration, determine the pH at any point along the following titrations for mono and polyprotic acids and bases: weak acid, strong base, strong acid, strong base, weak base, strong acid, and strong base, strong acid titrations. You should be able to match acids and their conjugate bases, or bases and their conjugate acids, in a balanced chemical reaction, determine the pH of a buffer solution, determine the quantities of acid and conjugate base needed to produce a buffer at a desired pH given the Ka of the acid. On the structure of a series of acids or bases, put them in order of their relative strengths of acidity or basicity. Given the pKa, pKb, Ka, or Kb, find the other three values. Given a titration curve, determine the pKa or pKb of a weak acid or base. Determine where the equivalence point is. Determine what type of titration was being conducted: strong acid, strong base, weak base, strong acid, etc. Determine the best acid-base indicator given the Ka of an acid being titrated and the Ka values for a series of indicators. For this particular series, the acid-base titrations, or acid-base chemistry, there are some terms that will be important. The first three are the various definitions for acids and bases. The first is the Arrhenius acid-base definition. After that came the Bronsted-Lowry acid-base definition, and finally the Lewis acid and base system. So you need to know how they are defined and be able to differentiate between them. You'll need to know what a buffer is, what we mean by conjugate acid-base pairs, know what the pH, pOH, pKw, pKa, and pKb are, mono and polyprotic acids and bases, what we mean by titration, what an amphoteric substance is, what is the acid or base dissociation constant, the equivalence point, what we mean by endpoint and how that differs from equivalence point, what we mean by an indicator, whether it's an acid-base indicator or the intervals at which indicators are good for. So those are the types of things that you'll be expected to know. But why is it that we actually care about acid-base chemistry? Well, an example of where acid-base chemistry meets everyday life is the contents of your stomach, right, is acidic. So the cells lining your stomach actually produce hydrochloric acid. The purpose of that is to kill unwanted bacteria. It helps also break down the food, and it activates the enzymes that break down your food. However, if the stomach acid backs up into your esophagus, it can irritate the tissues, resulting in heartburn. Another term for this is acid reflux. Mild cases of heartburn can be cured by neutralizing the acid in the esophagus. Your own saliva is slightly basic, so if you ever have a mild case of heartburn, trying to swallow a bit of your own saliva can actually help alleviate the heartburn. A better option is to take some bicarbonate, which is essentially what like Rolaids or Tums are, as a bicarbonate. I believe they're sodium bicarbonate. and that helps to neutralize some of the acid in your stomach and in the esophageal tract. So by taking these antacids that contain either weak hydroxide ions or carbonates, that enables us to neutralize some of the acid in your stomach. Now, a more chronic case of heartburn is GERD, or gastroesophageal reflux disease. It's a form of chronic heartburn that is found in some people. It involves, or GERD, which is the gastroesophageal reflux disease. It's a chronic leaking of stomach acid into the esophagus. A lot of times this happens when someone is lying down. The reason why it occurs is people with GERD, the diaphragm that is separating the muscles in the stomach from the esophagus, they don't close tightly enough. And when people lie down, the liquid in your stomach can actually leak up your esophageal tract. The way that physicians will diagnose GERD is by attaching a pH sensor to the esophagus to measure the acidity levels of the fluids over time. An interesting part of this is, if you ever have this test done, you can actually play with a pH sensor by eating or drinking various liquids. Like if you were to drink lemonade, the pH meter would spike because lemonade has a lot of citric acid in it, is fairly acidic. So some of the properties of acids. Acids have a sour taste. Absolutely do not try tasting the acids in the lab. Most of them are at fairly high concentration and will actually do significant damage. Acids have the ability to dissolve many, but not all, but many types of metals. They can neutralize bases, and they can change litmus paper to red. The fact that acids taste sour is actually the most foods that have a sour taste to them. It's because they have an acidic component. So like vinegar or lemons, vinegar has a sort of a sour taste because of the presence of acetic acid in it. Lemons have citric acid, and that's why a weak vinegar solution and a weak lemon solution will actually taste somewhat similar, because what you're really tasting is that sour note, which you have receptors in your tongue or for detecting acid, and the signal that goes to your brain is actually a sour taste. Bases, on the other hand, they have more of a bitter taste. Also, don't try this in lab. If you put a base between your fingers, rubbing it back and forth, it'll feel a little bit soapy. Also, do not try that in the lab. Bases have the ability to neutralize acid, and they will change red litmus paper to blue. The bitter taste is an interesting component for bases. There's not a lot of foods that are actually basic, and that's because the bitter flavor that you're tasting, we developed that ability because a lot of poisons actually are bases. And so most people don't really like bitter food. Children in particular don't like eating bitter food because of that relation between typically poisonous food and bases. However, things like coffee and chocolate actually have basic components to them, and that's why they have that bitter flavor. So that's the end of our overview. The next lecture we will be talking about what actually is the definition of an acid and what is the definition for a base.